Kansas and Nebraska, two bordering states that I am very familiar with in these United States. Both can trace their beginnings to the Kansas Nebraska Act. I guess you can call this whole video the Kansas Nebraska Act, am I right? Anyway, speaking of the Kansas Nebraska Act, it was one of the worst laws ever passed by Congress in American history, and ultimately led to the Civil War. Civil War, I say? Why, yes, I do say. This video just so happens to be sponsored by the Civil War game. There's a game called War and Peace about the American Civil War. I usually turn down video game sponsors, but I took this one on because I like the game. It's fun and educational. You learn both strategy and history. The goal is to win the war by building up your base. You can side with Abraham Lincoln and the Union, or Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy, you dang traitor. It features authentic Civil War era military weapons and multiple commanders based on famous Civil War personalities. To download the game, check out the link in the description. Thanks to War and Peace Civil War for sponsoring this video. Okay, so before I get into the Kansas Nebraska Act, let's briefly go into the entire histories of both states. And frankly, Kansas's history is a bit more exciting. Both have been settled by humans for thousands of years. Some were nomadic, others were sedentary. By the time Europeans got to the area in the 1500s and 1600s, prominent American Indian nations in modern-day Kansas included the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kansa, Kiowa, Osage, Pawnee, and Wichita. Wait, the Kansa? Yeah, Kansas is named after the Kansa Indians, for real. Prominent American Indian tribes in modern-day Nebraska included also the Cheyenne and Pawnee, but additionally the Lakota, Omaha, Otoe, and Ponca. Nebraska is named after the Otoe Indian word Nebrathka, which means flat water, in reference to the Platte River, which runs through the state. As you probably already guessed by now, the biggest cities in both states today, Wichita and Omaha, are both named after the Indian tribes. Anyway, yeah, so in 1541, a Spanish conquistador named Francisco Vasquez de Coronado and his expedition were the first Europeans to reach modern-day Kansas. Modern-day Nebraska wasn't really checked out by Europeans much until the 1700s. The French claimed it in 1714. Etienne de Bourgmont and his crew checked it out for the first time. Both the French and Spanish did not settle modern-day Kansas, but the French did do some trading along the Missouri River, which led to a trading post in modern-day Nebraska. The future states both completely were part of the Louisiana Purchase. Yep, the United States bought them in 1803. The next year, Lewis and Clark checked both out on their famous expedition. In 1806, Zebulon Pike's expedition passed through Kansas and assumed the area was too dry for farming. Thanks to him, and particularly a dude named Stephen Long, who checked out both modern-day Kansas and modern-day Nebraska in 1820, the western part of the Great Plains mistakenly got called the Great American Desert. Later on, when the American government was forcing American Indians off their lands back east and needed a place to relocate them, they were like, let's send them off to the crappy land we can't farm, out in the Great American Desert, eh? Of course, once they realized that land was actually good for farming, they kicked them off most of that land again later on, but I'm ahead of myself. In 1812, both were part of Missouri Territory. Americans actually settled in modern-day Nebraska first. The United States built Fort Atkinson along the Missouri River in 1819. 8 years later, it built Fort Leavenworth in modern-day Kansas, which is still active today. For many decades, Americans traveled through future Kansas and Nebraska, but rarely stopped there. As more pioneers moved west, the two biggest trails to form were the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail. Jump ahead to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which I mentioned at the beginning of this video. Remember how I mentioned it ended up being a major cause of the Civil War? Well, the law created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, opened them up for settlement, and allowed the new settlers to determine whether they would be admitted to the Union as a free state or slave state. This predictably caused a mad rush of pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates to Kansas, and violence would often occur between the two groups. That's where the territory earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Some argue the Civil War really began in Kansas. I've got a whole video about that. Oh, and I've also got a video about all of Kansas history. Check those out later or something. Anyway, the Free Staters would ultimately win. Shortly before the Civil War broke out on January 29, 1861, the United States admitted Kansas as a free state. Nebraska didn't become a state until 2 years after the Civil War ended, on March 1st, 1867. The Homestead Act, which promised 160 acres of free land to any settler as long as they lived on and improved that land for at least 5 years, brought tens of thousands of Americans and immigrants to both states, and the population of both skyrocketed for the rest of the 1800s. Most came to farm, but in Kansas, many came for the cattle industry, setting up cow towns like Wichita and Dodge City. The railroads had a dramatic impact on the development of both states. Railroad grants were free land given to the railroad companies so they could build railroads and sell off the land where settlers came to settle. However, many people didn't like these deals because they thought the railroad industry was ripping off settlers. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, Kansas and Nebraska farmers faced difficult times when droughts caused crop failures, and many of them lost their farms due to not being able to pay off debts. This, combined with reaction to railroad company monopolies, helped lead to the Populist movement, which was particularly big in both states. In fact, Omaha was the home of the convention that created the Populist Party in 1892. By the early 1900s, prosperity returned to both states, and both continued to grow. However, that trend reversed during the Great Depression, which devastated both. During the Depression, the Dust Bowl happened due to little rain, hot days, and high soil erosion. There was nothing holding the soil down, so the wind swept it up and created horrifying dust storms, turning the skies black. While it affected both states, it hit Kansas farmers particularly hard. Many fled to California after losing their farms. The farmers who stayed adapted to harsh conditions through efficient irrigation, contour farming, and planting millions of trees to hold the soil in the ground to keep it from eroding and blowing away. Today, agriculture still is extremely important in both states. So what else do they have in common? A freaking lot. First of all, both are in the middle of the country. Some insensitive people might call them two states right in the middle of flyover country, an often derogatory term that explains the part of the country that the majority of Americans fly over and literally look down on when traveling to and from large urban areas along the coast. Ugh. But let me tell you, if those planes actually landed in Kansas and Nebraska, they'd find two of the most friendly and beautiful places in the entire world. Both are about the same size. Kansas is slightly bigger. Most would classify both states as Midwestern states. The majority of the population lives in the eastern portion of both states. Both are dominated by cities located along their eastern borders. Kansas is heavily influenced by Kansas City. This is evident by looking at sports fans across the state. Since there's no MLB or NFL team in Wichita, for example, you'll see lots of Kansas City Chiefs and Kansas City Royals fans there. That said, I should stress I'm talking about the Kansas City metropolitan area. Half of the Kansas City metro is actually in Missouri, as well as the bigger, more famous Kansas City. Oh, I also have a video about that, in case you never caught it. Nebraska is heavily influenced by Omaha. However, once you do get far enough west in both states, they have their attention more directed to the Rocky Mountains to the west. Heck, they're even in the mountain time zone out there. Most of both states are in the Great Plains. Both have reputations for having kind of boring landscapes with lots of farms and, cows. However, both do have hills and varying landscapes. Oh, both do have lots of cows. More than any other state other than Texas. Nebraska has slightly more, though. Nebraska has more hills and is a bit more rugged. I mean, that's in Nebraska. So is that. It also has the beautiful Sand Hills region, which makes up a fourth of the entire state. Although Kansas apparently is flatter than a pancake, 6 other states are more flat.
Well, what about Mount Sunflower in Kansas, Mr. Beat?
That's not a mountain. That's just the highest point in Kansas.
Oh.
But yeah, Kansas has hills too, like the Flint Hills. Whoa, look at those. And then you have random places like this. The further west you go in both, the higher the elevation. The western two-thirds of both states are known for not having many trees. In fact, the further west you go in both states, the drier it gets, and thus the less trees there are and more due to the rain shadow created by those Rocky Mountains. Oh, except for the Nebraska National Forest in northeast Nebraska? Wait, huh? Well, that's actually the country's largest human-created forest. Located in the Sandhills, this is what it would have looked like before those trees were planted. But the legendary botanist Charles Bessey had the crazy idea to plant thousands of trees. Today, the forests look like they've been there forever. And it's federally protected land. I've driven through it, and it's so weird to drive through wide open grasslands with no trees in sight to all of a sudden, boom, you're in the forest, baby! The entire state of Nebraska actually has a proud tree planting history. After all, Julius Sterling Morton started Arbor Day there back in 1872, motivating Nebraskans to plant more than 1 million trees on that day. Both have mostly a continental climate, with 4 distinct seasons and a semi-arid climate in the far western portions. Being further south, Kansas does get a bit hotter in the summer and less cold in the winter. Thanks to the constant battle between winds from the north and south, the weather can quickly, dramatically change. One day, it could be 30 degrees Fahrenheit out. The next day, 70 degrees. Or you might be walking in the sunshine one moment, and the next you're in a giant hailstorm. The Missouri River makes at least part of the eastern border of both states. If it weren't for that river, Kansas would be a perfect rectangle. Same with Nebraska. Other than Colorado getting all up in Nebraska's business out west, the biggest natural disaster in both? Tornadoes.
It's a twister! It's a twister!
Yep, both states find themselves in Tornado Alley. One example of a devastating tornado is the one that hit Greensburg, Kansas on May 4th, 2007. It took out nearly the entire town. Since, Greensburg has rebuilt as one of the most environmentally friendly in the world, powered by wind turbines and with buildings built to not use much energy. Greensburg indeed. A lot of people in both trace their ancestry to Europe. Overall, Kansas is more ethnically diverse. The median age in both is about the same. The poverty rate in both is similar, although the median household income is a bit higher in Nebraska. Both states lean to the right politically. Since both are 2 of the smallest states in terms of population, they don't get many electoral votes. Nebraska is one of only 2 states, however, that splits up its electoral votes, which I think is pretty cool. It's called the Congressional District Method, since it awards 2 electoral votes to the state popular vote winner and divides up the rest to the popular vote winner in each of its 3 congressional districts. This led to a split electoral vote there in 2008. Obama won Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, which, no surprise, is basically Omaha and its suburbs. The biggest religion in both is Christianity, specifically evangelical Protestant. The rural and small town population of most towns in both states has been quickly declining. The Ogallala Aquifer, the largest in the Americas, is underground in both states, but most of it is in Nebraska. How about some differences? First of all, Kansas has more people. However, Nebraska is growing at a faster rate. More Kansans have college degrees. I have degrees from colleges in both states, by the way. However, Nebraska spends more money per student on education. Nebraska residents pay more in taxes. Also, the cost of living is higher there. That said, housing is much cheaper in both compared to most of the rest of the country. Nebraska has a higher minimum wage. Kansas has more crime. However, Nebraska has more pollution. According to Forbes magazine, Nebraska is a much better state for business. Other than agriculture, major industries in Kansas include manufacturing, professional services, and energy. Other major industries in Nebraska include financial services, transportation, insurance, and finance. Nebraska borders 6 states. Kansas, just 4. Sure, both states are landlocked and far from the ocean, but Nebraska is the only triple landlocked state in the country, meaning Nebraskans must travel through 3 states to get to an ocean. Nebraska is the only state in the country with a unicameral state legislature, meaning instead of having a House and a Senate like the United States Congress, it has just one governing body in its legislative branch. Kansas is the home of Freddy's. Nebraska is the home of Runza, home of the famous Runza sandwich. And ain't nothing more Nebraskan than the Runza sandwich, but the first Pizza Hut and White Castle also were in Kansas. Kansas often leads the country in wheat production, while Nebraska is often in the top 3 states in the country producing corn. Oh, so that explains those mascots. Oh, and Cornhusker football is basically a religion in Nebraska. Kansas has a huge natural gas field under it. Nebraska has more miles of rivers than any other state in the country. Let's see, how should I wrap this video up? I know, I'll go outside for a change. I'm here at the border of Kansas and Nebraska. That's Nebraska over here, Kansas over here. This video, I gotta say, was the easiest for me to ever research for this compared series. Why? Because Kansas and Nebraska are the only 2 states I have ever lived in. That's right, I'm a flyover country native. In Nebraska for 4 years, I lived in Omaha, and for the rest of my life, I lived in Kansas, all over the state actually. Specifically, I was born in Topeka, lived in Hutchinson, grew up mostly in Augusta, which is just outside of Wichita. I lived in Chanute, Lawrence, Manhattan, Baser, Overland Park, Lawrence again. Yeah, so this video was fairly easy for me to make. Which state should I live in next? I mean, which states should I cover next for this series? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you. Yeah, you that's watching this right now, I appreciate you. I may not know you, but I appreciate you.